All right, and as I talk too, I've got a lot of stuff, a lot of bullet kind of points to go through. So at any point, if you have a follow-up question, if you'll just kind of shout out. I know in a room like this, it may be hard to come through the mic. So, Dr. Brown, if I miss somebody asking a question, a follow-up question, I'd love for you to ask those questions. I'm not afraid of you asking or actually even disagreeing with me on some of these things. So you guys are seminary students and you've got opinions. So I'd love to hear some of those, especially if they're different opinions. So the overarching question is what our church is looking for in a worship pastor right now. And so as I was thinking about this, and I actually see, looks like maybe Dr. Wagner is on Zoom too. And I was, Dr. Brown and Dr. Kreider, these professors of yours are longtime friends. Dr. Lewis, Dr. Caston, Dr. John Duncan, who does some online stuff, and Dr. Wagner. These are all people I've come into contact, in addition to your other faculty, and all these professors, I'm sure, how they're preparing you. They're preparing you with lots of tools and skills for ministry and for potentially interviewing with maybe the first church you've ever served in. So knowing these guys like I do and their background, they are some of the best in preparing you for ministry for different church contexts. So as you leave Southwestern, you're going to be prepared for many different church contexts. And so I appreciate them and that foundation that they're laying for you. And one thing about them that you may not know is they're not only academicians, but they're also practitioners. They're local church, and many of you know that. There's a difference between just being a professor that's an academic and somebody that's actually practicing in a local church. And these guys do that regularly, so they understand some of those things. So a couple of overarching things, and I want to talk about how maybe some of those questions that or what churches are looking for have changed post-COVID. Some of those things. And then I want to talk about some characteristics potentially that churches may want to ask but not really know how to ask or even know to ask, as things that they're looking for that you could potentially help them understand as you're going through an interview process. So they're looking for somebody obviously that's skilled in musical ability as you are, and able to lead a congregation in their music and worship and all areas of that and all the programs and all the ministries and that Sunday worship event too. So musical preparation obviously is vital, but there are so many more elements to that. So there are some post-COVID questions that I think have surfaced. And these are some things maybe that churches are looking for, and they're asking these questions, and they don't have the answers, and many of us don't either, but they're questions that I think you should at least consider as you're thinking about potentially interviewing in the future. So some of these questions are contextual, but let me just kind of fly through these. These are some things that have surfaced post-COVID. And many of you know, and if you're serving in any church context, you know how things changed and have continued to change on the other side of that, the shutdown and reboot and all the things that happened. So here's just some bullet questions that maybe search teams will be asking. So they might be asking, if worship is supposed to be participative instead of passive, then how can you, they may ask, help lead us into both in-person and virtual worship? And then how can we measure worship participation when it's just virtual? Intergenerational, actually, during COVID, if you remember, or if you experienced that, families were forced to worship together. And so intergenerational worship was kind of forced during that season. So churches are then asking, how do we leverage what happened during that season in intergenerational worship when we gather back together? We're going to talk more about intergenerational in just a few minutes. And another one is since prayer is foundational to our worship, then how do we keep people? And I was the same person doing this from home. How do we keep people from checking out virtually in the service during prayer times when they're worshiping virtually, and when they don't feel that same connection as you do in person? And some of those worship actions, here's another one. some of those worship actions that seem so natural in person often seem contrived when people are coming in virtually. So there's a mixture of both those things. We have in-person worship, but we still have a lot of people, and some churches as much as 50% still, that are worshiping online and have not come back. Another one is, I think the virtual worship actually caused us then to revert back, and we had to do this, caused us to revert back to a few that were leading while the rest of us watched. And so how can we involve virtual worshipers as more than just bystanders that are watching that service? So the virtual and in-person. And we're going to talk again a little bit later too about the understanding of the difference between passive and participative worship too. One that's really surfaced, and I think surfaced quite a bit during that season, that continues to surface, is there a biblical and practical way to observe communion both physically and virtually, in person and online? Is there a biblical and practical way? So, some believe that you couldn't do that from home. Others believed you could do it with cheese, it, cracker, and grape juice. So is there a biblical and practical way to do that? And these are questions you may be asked if you're interviewing through that process, or what churches are, as they're trying to walk through that, they want to know how you as a potential worship leader could help them weather some of those things. Another one that it was surfaced even before then, because there's some statistics that say that churches that have less than 35% of their giving that online, meaning that people they give online instead of in person. Churches with less than 35% before COVID, there are very few churches that were growing that had less than 35% of their giving online. When all that blew up over the last few years, then that percentage has drastically increased. So is there, again, a biblical and practical way to observe the offering as a sacred action when it's only given virtually or in a kiosk after the service? So how can you do that, or how would you do that if a church asks you that question? A couple more. How can we encourage our congregation to connect with each other during worship when they aren't even in the same room? This is a great question for multi services too. Is it possible for guests to feel welcomed as a part of the community, that body, when they have no physical connection to that body? A couple more, and then we'll move into. So I'm going to talk about some characteristics that they may be looking for. Most churches, I think, realized that it was necessary for online worship, when that occurred, to be simpler and less contrived. We had to actually synthesize what we did when we were doing virtual worship. So what should we have, or did we learn from that as we come back together? How does a church keep from falling back into those previous practices of overstimulating or over innovating in the future, so that they don't fall back into that practice of how can next Sunday be more of an event than the previous Sunday was? And I think we learned during that season the value of leaving some of those services on the cutting room floor and just landing on those things that really mattered. And last one, some of the previous worship service elements during that season. Worship service elements, worship service programming, music and ministry programs in our local congregations. Many of those elements prior to the last 3 years, we thought we couldn't live without, but we actually did for a season. So if a search committee was asking you the question, how would you determine then what our congregation should or shouldn't reintegrate again in the future? Those are questions that some of those congregations are asking, I think, post-COVID, that they didn't ask prior to that. So it used to be that worship service or worship search committees used to be looking for someone, and they still are, who could lead choirs and orchestras and worship bands and children's choirs and congregational singing, all those elements that you're being prepared for. and they are still looking for those skills, but now they're also looking for worship leaders who understand planning center and church technology and streaming and in-ears and multi-tracks, in addition to all those other things. And they want candidates who speak the different musical and technological languages. And so my challenge to you would be, and I know you are being prepared for that, but if you are not fluent in those languages, you need to be. And even though you might not use all those languages, you need to be ready to use them no matter where you go. So another reality is the post-COVID church, and I don't know if this is true in Texas. It's true in our convention, and it's true in other state conventions too, that the post-COVID church is smaller. The attendance is not, and probably never will be back to where it was. And so now churches are trying to no longer go back and say, how can we get those people back? But now that some of our seats are empty, how do we reach out to new people? And so it's going to be different in the future related to that. Some of our largest congregations are still at 50% in person. And yeah, they're still, they still have 1,500 people in worship, but that's still half of what they had before. So how do we respond to those kind of things in the future? So I think with that understanding, some things that have surfaced now is that churches are looking for music and worship pastors that can do more than one thing. And so if you're not preparing yourself for something beyond that, I wrote a blog post a couple of years ago that even the title was intended to be pithy, but the title was something like worship leaders should get a real job. Now, I didn't mean that worship leader is not a real job, but the reality is that in the future, and as we've seen, and even in the future for some of you, there will be seasons when you need to learn how to do something else besides just your music and worship. And that may be in the local church, or it may not be, because as many even larger churches now are looking for service worship leaders, but where they're not looking for a full-time staff worship leader. And that's happening even in some of our larger congregations. So what else can you do? And if you can't do something else, then it's going to be hard for you to find a position. Now, even in the local church, what else can you do? Because again, as some of those churches are declining numerically, they can't afford as many staff members as they had before. So can you do something else besides just music and worship leading, technology, administration, discipleship, small groups, next gen, whatever that is? Worshiping college students. We've got a worship leader in our convention that started a college campus ministry that we can pour some money in, even from our convention standpoint. So and it's even recycled back that the old music and youth or worship and students is now resurfacing again, because they're looking for more than just a Sunday worship leader. And if Sunday worship is the only thing you do, it's going to be hard for a congregation to justify one full-time person just for that too. And as churches, as some of the programming things were potentially shut down and haven't started back, whatever that might be, children's choirs or worship choir, orchestra, those, if they aren't firing those things back up, then those things that filled your week are no longer there. So don't just learn how to do one thing, expand. I'm a baseball fan, and it's spring training right now. And in baseball, there are those players that are some of the greatest players are called the 5-tool baseball players. And so they have 5 things that they do really well. They hit and bat that for average, so they've got a good batting average. They hit for power, means they can hit, average it, and home runs. They can play defensively, so they can catch and scoop up and grounders defensively. They have speed, so they can run the bases fast, and they can steal bases. And then they're able to throw runners out from the outfield or the infield or wherever that might be. So those are those 5-tool baseball players. So my challenge then is you're thinking about these interview things, they're going to be asking you what you can do besides lead worship on Sunday, because they're going to be looking to fill some of those holes with existing staff. So even though some churches think we're looking for just the home run hitter on the platform, they're really now looking, I think, for those 5-tool kind of worship leadership with other things too. So I'll talk about what some of those characteristics are in just a minute. So with that kind of overview, many of these music and worship search committees, some of them don't even know what to ask. We assume that they've got this list, and they do. And some of those things, they don't really know what they need, or even how to find out what they need, sometimes beyond comparing your skills with the skills of the previous worship pastor they had, good or bad comparison. Some might even say that we want more or less of what we had in our last leader. Or if he or she wasn't this, then we need something that is that. Or if he was this, then we need more of whatever this is. So they're often looking for a platform presence that, they know that they want somebody that's on the platform that can engage the congregation in worship, but sometimes they don't know what to ask beyond that. So they're looking for somebody that can potentially play and conduct and sing without considering then the depth of some of those other leading elements of worship, the leading worship in spirit and in truth. And so it's your responsibility, I believe, as you're talking to these churches and potentially interviewing with these churches, to help them understand maybe what they need to. So some of the things I'm going to suggest as questions that could surface, maybe questions that search committees don't even know how to ask or to ask, that you could help them understand with that too. Mm-hmm. So because your musical ability and worship leading skills may help you actually secure that worship pastor position, your relationships and theological depth will help you keep that position. So it's not enough just to get the job. You've got to be able to keep that job too. So it's your responsibility then, not only when you're talking with them and responding to those questions, to help them understand some of those characteristics, but then even when you get on the field, you should be modeling that for your congregation too. So with that, let me kind of fly through some characteristics, and I've got quite a few of them. We'll get to as many as we can. It's not an exhaustive list, and it's not hierarchical, so it's not in order of importance. It's just they're just down here. So before I jump into those, any questions so far? All right.
We're good.
Yeah. Yep. All right. And I'll tell you this too. And Dr. Brown, I'll send you kind of it's a rough manuscript of this.
Okay.
So that way you're not having to try to take as many notes, but you can take as much as you want. But I'll send this to Dr. Brown, and if you need follow-up questions on that,
okay,
since there's quite a few of them, we can do that.
We can post this on your Canvas. Matthew, you had a question?
Oh yeah. Just a clarification type thing. When you were talking about worship pastors needing to find or the ways of the real job thing, were you talking more within the church or bivocational outside of the church?
Yes, to both.
Yes, and both.
Yes. Yeah, to both. Because I believe that at least what we're seeing in our convention, this may not be true in Texas, but I think it's true nationwide, that churches are actually starting to move more to, especially as programming has declined, where the main worship emphasis is what happens on Sunday, is they can't justify a full-time worship pastor just for that. Mm-hmm. So it could be that some of that what the language there is, that we've moved toward even is that co-vocational, not bivocational, mm-hmm. meaning that you're still a minister and worship leader in the marketplace at the same time you would be in a local church. So the answer to that's a great question. The answer to that is both. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think if you want to, I don't want to use the word, well, I'm going to use it, but don't mean this unbiblical, but the marketability of your position internally in the church is, if the only thing you can do is what you do on the platform on Sunday, it's going to be hard to justify a full-time position doing that. So are there some other areas that complement that, or even other areas in the church where that could justify that full-time position on church staff? So the answer to that is both. And good question.
I have a question.
Yep, Landry.
So, this is kind of a difficult question, I guess, for all of us to consider, but I've heard of certain churches putting, house church networks in place just in case something happens politically in the next couple of years.
Mhm.
And we're not allowed to meet anymore because, that's a possibility. It could happen. With that in mind and being bivocational, is that kind of where we're headed, where, churches kind of move to more of a house church model like they are in the East? Do you think that's where we're headed, or?
Yeah, I'm not a prophet on that, and yeah, who knows? I mean, there's a possibility of that. So one of my challenges would be our responsibility as worship leaders. And I'm sure Dr. Brown and some of your other professors have quoted Harold Best before, but Harold Best talks about that worship is continuous, just depending on whom or what we're worshiping. One of our responsibilities as worship leaders is not only what we do on Sunday, but it's how we model and train our congregations to worship the other 168 hours of the week, or whatever the number is. That we need to help them understand that worship is not just what we do when we gather in here, but it's also who we are out there. And so are we training our congregations for the future of whatever that might be? If it means house churches or things like that, are we training them so that they are continually worshiping when they disperse as much as they are when they gather? So that's a challenge to us as worship leaders, not just to prepare them for what happens on Sunday, but to prepare them for potential worship that occurs during the week. Because we don't know, again, when a pandemic might hit and we're trying to learn how to worship from home, where families don't know how to lead their family in worship. And if the only thing we're doing is what we do on Sunday morning, is that preparing them for how to worship throughout the week too? So I don't know what the future will hold, but I think we as worship leaders have a responsibility beyond that large gathering that we prepare for each week.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let me jump into a couple of these, and then we'll see if you have some more questions, because I'm gonna fly through some of these. All right, so and these are just kind of bullet points, and I'll have just kind of a statement after the bullet point on that. So here's the first one. I think these churches are looking for leaders, and again, some of these may be things they don't even know they need to look for, but they won't know it until they actually have it, and they'll think, why didn't we have that before? So here's one. They're looking for leaders who are willing to learn more people's names than new songs. People are more important than projects. So what will your congregation remember more about your leadership? That new worship song you taught on Sunday, or the time you spent with that family in the hospital during the week? Because you're never going to teach enough new songs to make up for relational failures.
Amen.
So those ministry projects are important. They're vital, the things that we do, but don't leave people in your wake on the way to that project. Several years ago, my wife and I went to New England on vacation, and our goal was that we wanted to go to Vermont, and so we had a Airbnb reserved in Vermont for a week, and then we were going to spend that whole time in New England, and we decided to drive instead of fly. And our goal was to get to Vermont, but what we realized is we wanted to take our time to get to Vermont too, and we would have missed some beautiful country if we had just thought, okay, our destination is there. And so there's also that time in between, that meantime. There's a word for that liminal time in between that leads us into that place. So don't enjoy the relationships along the way. Don't leave people in your wake to actually get to that destination. Here's another one. Worship search teams may not know they need this, but their worship ministry will be healthier if you, as the worship leader, learn how to take a Sabbath every week. Sunday for you as worship leaders is not a Sabbath.
Amen.
Someone once said that those of us in ministry, if you're in ministry, it's like Sunday for you is like giving birth, only to realize on Monday morning that you're pregnant again. So Sunday comes every week, and you're constantly having to crank that out every week. So it's not a day of rest for you as worship leaders. So there's a great challenge for you. How can you possibly lead others to a place you no longer have the resolve to go yourself because you're just worn out? Jesus talks about that. Come to me, all you're weary and burdened, I will give you rest. And so sometimes that burden that we're carrying is a burden of our own making, and not that yoke that's easy and light that Jesus promised us. Here's another characteristics that will encourage, I think, longevity in ministry, and I think churches are looking for that. And they don't even know this until they actually have it. And this is kind of just a short statement. Drink more coffee with senior adults. Be willing to drink more coffee with senior adults. I had a guy in our church when I was on church staff 25 or 30 years ago that would come into my office on Wednesday rehearsal day. I had still half a day of rehearsal preparation left to do, and he would come in and want to spend a couple hours just hanging out and drinking coffee with me. And at the time, it seemed like a distraction, but I realize now, decades later, how much of a divine appointment that was for me. Because Charlie cared more about me and me succeeding than he wasn't even in the music and worship ministry in our church. But because I spent time drinking coffee with Charlie, he was one of my greatest supporters. And Charlie even made the statement one time to me, David, I don't really like your songs, but I like you. And so we're going to do those songs because I see the value in it, and I'm going to sing just as loud as I would if I actually knew and liked the songs, because I like you. So there's some relational things, and that's one of the elements that you'll see in some of these comments. These are not musical issues; these are relational issues. Most of our leaders that have failed in ministry in my 23 years of being with the convention, it rarely, if ever, beyond a moral failure or something illegal, it rarely, if ever, had anything to do with their skill in their field. It was because of relational and leadership breakdowns. Is because they couldn't get along with people, and that's why they often failed. Here's another characteristic. Search team, again, may not yet know this yet, but if you know this, you can help them. Is that you are willing to come in and pray for and defend your pastor even when he doesn't deserve it. And there are going to be times, sometimes in your ministry, and you think, he doesn't deserve me to pray for him. And praying for your pastor, even when he doesn't deserve it, means that you're not just praying for him to move to another church, so you don't have to deal with him anymore. It may not, and when we're praying for him, it may not change him, but it could change you and your attitude toward him. And then when you change your attitude toward him, then it may actually change that relationship with him too. I think one questions that always arises too in that search process is that search teams are going to be looking for a worship pastor with a healthy family life. So here's a couple of challenges related to that. Leave more things at the office when you go home in the evening. There's always one more song, one more service to plan, one more event, but leave more things at the office when you go home. Another question to ask of that you might ask how something might impact your family before asking how it might impact your job. There's always one more thing to do. A few years ago, I did an article a couple of years ago, and again, it was kind of intentional clickbait title, and the title was are you having an extramarital affair with worship leading? So what that would look like is that, unscheduled calls and texts from worship team members are those divine interruptions, but unscheduled calls or texts from your spouse or children are disrespectful intrusions. Or maybe you expect your spouse to have that same passion for your worship leadership as you do. Or maybe you attend worship conferences in these exotic locations, but don't have enough time for family vacations or romantic weekend getaway. Or maybe you spend your evenings when you are at home on YouTube or Spotify or Planning Center. And when you do that, you're not really home emotionally and relationally, even though you are home physically. Or you assume being called to lead worship is a higher calling than you're called to be a godly husband or wife. Or maybe you have a different spiritual or physical persona on the platform than you actually do at home. So there's the final one on this. There are lots of other churches, but you only have one family. And so if a church demands that you sacrifice your family for ministry, find another church, because your family is ministry. All right, here's another one, and then I'll stop, see if we have any questions before we jump in some more. Probably one thing church team is looking for, again, don't really know, is how to verbalize it, is the desire for a worship leader that is going to continue to learn even once they get on the field. So also that they are willing to learn more theology than musicology, because musicianship is important for a worship leader. Obviously, we are leading in music and worship as a part of worship, but only a part of that worship. But understanding who God is and what he means to you personally, and then teaching in that and modeling that for your congregation is way more important than just those musical skills. In fact, I would say this: music is important, but theology is more important as a worship leader. Yet the question I would ask is, where are you spending most of your time then? Are you spending most of your time being musically prepared or theologically prepared?
You're getting Joe excited over here.
All right, so let me stop. Let's see if you have any questions, and I've got twice that many more if we have time.
Hey, Lena.
How would you approach, like, if the church is demanding a lot from you that takes you away from home and things like that? How would you approach that to your pastor? Like, is there an easy way, or just like hands up and just find another church? Or is there a better way to approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it would be contextual too. And I think it depends on the pastor and the relationship with the pastor. I talked about, we encourage our pastors to take sabbaticals, have sabbatical rest. And we try to put pieces in place to help them get to that place. But if the lead pastor, senior pastor in a congregation is not willing to do that, or doesn't model what it means to have a healthy family, it's going to be hard for support staff to actually do that too, because if they are modeling sacrificing their family, it's going to be hard to have that conversation about you not having to do the same thing. So it is a little bit contextual with that. If you've got a pastor that resonates with that, and you can partner together and say, how can we do this together, or congregation, and sometimes conversations like this takes some time. Again, you can get to that place where you've made enough deposits in your congregation to start making some of those withdrawals too, and it may be a learning thing for them of those demands, because in ministry we're pretty much on call 24 hours a day. And so helping them understand that might be a process. So it's not an automatic thing to say, hey, I don't get a Sabbath every week, and I'm away from my family more than I need to be, so I'm just going to quit and go to another church. That's a process to get to that place, because then you're just kind of jumping from church to church if there's something you don't really like, or it doesn't really is not accommodating your family. But if there comes a point when it is a pattern of expectation, and you potentially can see where that can be detrimental to your family, and you have some responsibility. And I don't know where you all in your life with family and children, things like that, but we have responsibility, I believe, to God first, family second, ministry after that. And so if your ministry in local church is actually causing you to sacrifice your family, then you need to evaluate that. And if there's a way to potentially communicate and talk through that in a healthy way, and you can move toward that as a congregation, then that would be the best way to do it. But ultimately, if the demands are, no, we expect you to sacrifice your family, then that's when I would say, again, what I said a second ago, there's lots of other churches, but you only have that one family. So don't sacrifice that family just for that one church.
Thank you.
Oh, Nelly. Nelly's way over on the side.
Okay.
There we go.
How would you encourage, because I really love that aspect, but how would you encourage the minority of us that don't have a family and that have all the time in the world maybe to invest in ministry? So what would be the priority there?
I didn't hear you real well. Can you clarify that from Mark what the question
Well,
was?
so if for the minister that has a family, if our hierarchy is God, family, church, if you are a single person and Nellie's throwing herself up as an example, I'll throw Chuck Lewis in as an example. So if you don't have that, if you've got God and church, well,
Yeah.
How should the single person manage their need for personal downtime or taking care of themselves in order to keep ministry?
Yeah, I don't think I think that Sabbath rest, that's where you come back to that. That's a necessity. If you're thinking, well, I don't have a family, so I might as well just work all the time. Again, how can you that's physically, emotionally, spiritually will potentially put you in a place where you'll have a hard time saying no to things. And some of those, you'll get to a place where spiritually and physically and emotionally you're worn out. And so you've got to take that time away even from that. So then, and when you do, the congregation actually gets the better part of you. That if you're filling all your time doing things for the congregation and not taking time for your own self to rest. I mean, Jesus set the example. He said, get away and watch how I do it. Eugene Peterson talks about that, and he says it's that unforced rhythms of grace. Mm-hmm. There's that James Bryan Smith wrote a book called The Good and Beautiful God, and it talks about those rhythms of silence and solitude and rest and the value of those. Your ministry will be much stronger when you take some time away from it than if you because you've got all that time, you fill up your time actually doing that ministry. So taking some time away, like Jesus did. And if you remember the text, it says that Jesus, when the crowd was going to try to make Jesus king, and he got away, the text says that he got away again by himself for that time away with the Father, that time of rest, indicating it had happened more than once. And so it's a rhythm and a pattern that will then make your ministry much stronger if you'll have those rhythms of rest and separation from that. All right, let me go through a few more here. We've got just a few more minutes here, and I may fly through these, and then we'll see if we have some final questions. Another characteristic I think we need is, and sometimes congregations don't even know to ask this, but we need to surround ourselves with those in our ministry to protect us from our own stupidity. All right. And what that means is that not everything that enters your mind always has to exit your mouth, or we need to understand the difference sometimes between knowing we can do something and deciding if we should. It's that Hebrews chapter 12, that great cloud of witnesses that surround us. So it's that those people that encourage us and lift us up, and we intentionally put them in place to help us evaluate those kind of things. Most churches are looking for leaders that will stay longer too. And so maybe, again, we need to spend, when things aren't going well, we need to spend more time trying to renew or revive those relationships than we spend on job placement sites every time something doesn't go well. So, and then, ask those questions. Am I leaving here because I'm running from something or to something? That you might ask both those questions. I think too, one of the things that this element beyond music is we need to celebrate communion more often and teach our congregations that. Some congregations don't know what that means, but that's one of those elements I think that could really help a congregation. Here's another one. Some search teams may say something like, we want a leader who can lead biblical worship. And they don't really know what they're asking, but what they're really meaning, I think, is that we as worship leaders, we should begin all worship planning and implementation with scripture and prayer instead of song titles. So start in the word, and then the word and prayer then will organically yield that song selection. So instead of starting on Spotify or YouTube to plan your worship, start in the word to do that. Most search teams are looking for someone that will facilitate. I talked about this briefly, and I know Dr. Brown has shared some of this with you, because this is the language we both learned in doctoral work too. Is that they're looking for somebody that can lead participative and not passive worship. So ask yourself the question, and they should ask you the question: are you going to be somebody that does everything for us, or are you going to help us do it too? A couple more, and then I'll see if you have any final questions. This is just kind of a quick one. I think they're going to be looking for somebody that practices leadership more than they practice their guitar. Okay, that's again that musicianship and theological background for that. A universal one too that you're going to guarantee you will have this. Can you as a leader cast vision for the future of our church without denigrating the past? Or are you going to come in and randomly just blow things up? Sometimes in a congregation that the only new in that congregation may be to do what they're already doing better. And the only new may be your attitude too, as you come in there. So don't automatically assume because you're new that you need to blow things up. All right, one more. I'm kind of flying through some of these, and I'll send all these because I didn't even get to all these, but here's the last one. And this is a challenge, two challenges. Don't lead worship just because you don't don't lead worship just because you don't know how to do anything else. All right. If you're just leading worship because you love to play and sing, because you want to supplement your income, because you enjoy being up front and that notoriety, or because people think you're really good at it, you may be doing it out of your compulsion to lead, might be out of convenience or conceit instead of calling. So a calling is that divine voice of God saying to you. In fact, that conceit says this is what people say I'm good at. Convenience says this is what I was trained to do. But calling says this is what God created me to do. So don't serve in that role just because you think you're really good at it. And here's a final challenge. Don't interview with the church with the attitude that this church is going to be a step on the ladder to something bigger and better after this. So don't interview with the attitude that I'm going to serve my time here until something better comes along here in the future. Because if you aren't giving your best to where God calls you now and are saving that best to where God might call you next, why would he want to? All right, we got just maybe a 1 minute or so. Any quick question? I know we've kind of flown through these, and I'll send some more.
Recording will be queued up.
All right, they all think you did the mic drop on that. So anything from anyone?
Thank you.
Oh, Caitlin.
Yeah, Doctor. So thank you so much for talking with us today. Just enjoyed this conversation. Just wondering, so I know many of us in here probably already have maybe another degree, and it's probably still in the music realm. So for me personally, I have an undergrad in music education. So when you say to be good at something else, would you recommend, you know, getting another degree in something that has to do with music or doing something else, like away from music? Just what's your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, you got to determine for you what's going to be the best for the future for you. One of the things that, you know, I did undergrad in church music and master's in church music, and then my doctoral degree was in worship studies. I wanted to intentionally have more of a theological understanding of worship, not a music degree. And so, which is ironic because now I'm executive director of our convention and I'm still teaching and writing in the area of worship, but I'm not actually leading worship. And so some of those skills are developed over time too. So it doesn't mean you always have to be educationally prepared for those. But again, I think that comes back to the calling. God, what are you calling me to do in the future? And if it's something even beyond music and worship, how can I prepare for that? If not educationally, then even vocationally, or accountability to somebody that's actually doing that. So I know we kind of have time to answer a longer question, but I think you've got to determine again what is God calling me to do in the future, and do I need to prepare educationally for something beyond just this, so that I'm prepared to do more than just this in the future.
Absolutely.
Yep, Jessica.
On the vein of sabbatical, I imagine it varies at least slightly from person to person, but in general, how often do you recommend a sabbatical be taken?
Yep. Yeah, that varies from church to church. Some of our churches do every 5 years, and they'll do like a month off or 6 weeks potentially. And that's separate from vacation, because if you've ever been on vacation with your family, that's not a sabbatical. Especially if you're going like Disney and stuff like that, that's just, you're not rested when you come back. So that Sabbath or sabbatical time is more like a month or so, a longer period of time for rest. So it really depends on church to church. We have one church that actually then there's a multi-site church, 12 campuses, and all of their ministry staff take a weekend sabbatical every 7th weekend. And they've got that rhythm going on, and their staff believes that they don't care if they don't get a raise, just don't take that away from them.
Okay. How many churches do you know, David, that actually provide sabbaticals for their? 'Cause I've only started one church that did that.
Yeah, I saw some statistics of nationwide. They're like 35%, but that's whatever that means. It doesn't say that may be 2 weeks, that may be a month.
Well,
I think that's increasing. We're really encouraging churches to do that, and it is sometimes a hard sell for a congregation, because you've got business leaders that are saying we don't get that in our job. In fact, I had that conversation with a committee one time, and my challenge to him was, maybe you should. And since when does the church have to follow what culture is doing? Could the church model for what culture of healthy work environment could be on the other side of that?